What if the most sacred places held hidden horrors? What if the very institutions meant to offer solace were also steeped in suffering? Imagine living in a time when your body was a mystery, your pain a penance and healing an act of divine will, not scientific understanding. This was the reality for women seeking healthcare in monasteries in 906. Number 8. The body as a mystical riddle, not a biological machine. Imagine waking up feeling unwell, a strange ache in your side, or a fever burning through your skin. In 960, and particularly within the quiet, hallowed halls of a monastery, understanding what was happening inside your own body was less about scientific inquiry and more about spiritual interpretation. For women, this was an especially perplexing and often terrifying reality. The human body, particularly the female form, was viewed not as a complex biological system to be meticulously studied and understood through observation and experimentation, but often as a vessel deeply intertwined with spiritual forces, moral failings, and cosmic alignments. Medical knowledge, such as it was, drew heavily from ancient Greek and Roman theories, primarily the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humors were believed to govern not only physical health, but also personality, emotions, and even destiny. When a woman fell ill, the prevailing belief was that these humors were out of balance. Too much phlegm might mean a cold, too much yellow bile could cause a fever, and an excess of black bile was often blamed for melancholy, or what we might now recognize as depression. The idea was simple, yet its implications for diagnosis and treatment were profoundly limited and often dangerously misdirected. For a woman, her unique biological functions, menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, were particularly prone to mystical and humoral explanations. Menstruation, for instance, was frequently seen as a purging or a release of excess humors or even impurities. If a woman's cycle was irregular or absent, it wasn't a sign of hormonal imbalance or a specific medical condition, but perhaps a buildup of these humors, requiring intervention to force a release. Historical accounts describe concoctions made from various herbs, often bitter and potent, administered with the aim of opening the body or drawing out the perceived excess. Concept of the wandering womb was another chilling example of this lack of anatomical understanding. Derived from ancient Greek medical texts that still held sway, it was believed that the uterus could literally move freely within a woman's body, causing a range of ailments depending on where it decided to settle. If it moved upwards, it might cause suffocation or mental distress. If it moved downwards, it could lead to other physical complaints. This idea was not some fringe belief. It was a widely accepted medical theory for centuries. Imagine being told your profound physical discomfort or even your emotional distress was due to an organ literally floating around inside you. There was no understanding of the intricate network of nerves, muscles, and bones that hold organs in place. There was no concept of hormones, no grasp of the complex endocrine system that governs so much of women's health. The internal organs, especially those related to reproduction, were often shrouded in an additional layer of mystery, considered sacred, yet also potentially sources of weakness or sin. Monastic infirmaries, where some semblance of healthcare was offered, operated within these profound limitations. The monks or nuns who served as infirmarians were not trained in modern anatomy or physiology. Their knowledge came from a mixture of inherited ancient texts, folk remedies, and their own limited observations, all filtered through a lens of religious dogma and the prevailing humoral theory. A physician-monk might consult a Latin treatise copied generations ago describing an illness in terms of a humor imbalance and then prescribe a treatment aimed at restoring that balance. This might involve bloodletting, where small incisions were made to remove blood believed to be bad humors. Or it might involve purging, using strong laxatives or emetics to cleanse the body. These were not targeted interventions based on a detailed understanding of the ailment, but rather broad attempts to reset a perceived systemic imbalance. Consider a young nun suffering from persistent abdominal pain. A modern doctor would investigate possible causes like appendicitis, ovarian cysts, or digestive issues. In 960, an infirmarian might attribute it to an excess of black bile, or a wandering womb, or even a divine test of her faith. Treatment might involve prayer, herbal poultices applied externally, or a course of emetics to cleanse the body from within. There was no way to visualize the inside of the body, no surgical instruments precise enough for internal exploration, and no understanding of sterile technique. The idea that tiny, invisible creatures could cause disease was centuries away from acceptance. Instead, disease was an imbalance, a spiritual failing, or a cosmic misfortune. The absence of a fundamental scientific understanding of the human body meant that women, especially, were subjected to generalized, often ineffective, and sometimes harmful treatments based on an almost mystical interpretation. Their bodies were not seen as intricate machines to be repaired, but as mysterious vessels subject to forces beyond their comprehension or control. Number 7. Childbirth as a perilous journey without a map for women in 960, and regardless of whether they were living within the cloistered walls of a monastery or in the nearby village. Childbirth was an experience fraught with unimaginable peril. It was often referred to as lying in, a period of intense vulnerability and profound risk, akin to facing a fierce battle. There was no medical understanding of the birthing process as we know it today. Concept of obstetrics, with its specialized knowledge of fetal development, maternal health, and delivery complications, simply did not exist. Instead, the journey of childbirth was seen as a natural, albeit dangerous, process that relied heavily on the woman's resilience, the support of other women, and above all, divine intervention. Death in childbirth was not an anomaly. It was a grimly accepted reality, casting a long shadow over every pregnancy. When a woman, be she a laywoman, seeking solace in a monastic community, or perhaps a nun in a rare and scandalous instance of conception, entered labor, she was stepping into an unknown and terrifying void. There was no prenatal care, no way to monitor the health of the mother or the baby beforehand. Malnutrition was common, weakening bodies already susceptible to illness. Many women, especially those in poorer communities, would have been anemic or suffering from other nutrient deficiencies that significantly increased the risks of hemorrhage or prolonged labor. There were no ultrasounds to check the baby's position, no measurements to assess the birth canal, no blood tests to detect potential complications. The entire process was largely left to fate and the crude skills of the attending individuals. Primary attendants during childbirth were almost exclusively women, known as midwives. These women, while crucial to the birthing process, were not formally trained in any medical sense. Their knowledge was passed down through generations, a mixture of practical experience, folklore, and superstition. They would use herbal remedies to induce labor or ease pain, often with uncertain efficacy and potential side effects. They might employ various physical maneuvers like pushing on the abdomen or encouraging specific positions to aid delivery, but without any true understanding of the underlying anatomy or physiology. In cases of difficulty, their options were extremely limited. If a baby was breached, or if the labor was prolonged and obstructed, there was little to be done. Surgical interventions like cesarean sections were almost unheard of, and if attempted, were almost always fatal for the mother due to infection and hemorrhage. The historical record suggests that the mother usually died during or shortly after such a procedure, the focus often being on saving the infant, a tragic choice that sometimes had to be made. Monasteries, while sometimes offering hospitality and care, generally did not have specialized birthing facilities. If a laywoman came to a monastery to give birth, she would likely be accommodated in a simple room, perhaps the infirmary or a guest chamber, but it would lack any dedicated medical equipment. The care provided by nuns would be more akin to nursing and spiritual support than skilled midwifery. They would offer warmth, comfort, and prayers, perhaps administering herbal teas, known for their calming properties, but they lacked the specific expertise to handle complex obstetric emergencies. For a nun, the act of giving birth within the monastery walls would have been an immense scandal, potentially leading to immediate expulsion or severe penance, highlighting the harsh societal and religious judgments surrounding female sexuality and procreation outside of approved marriage. One of the most terrifying realities of childbirth in 960 AD was the overwhelming threat of infection. With no knowledge of germs or sterile practices, the environment was ripe for bacterial proliferation. Hands were not washed before attending to the mother. Instruments, if any, were not sterilized, and the birthing area itself was unlikely to be hygienically prepared. Puerperal fever, often caused by streptococcal bacteria, was a common and deadly killer. A woman might survive the grueling labor only to succumb to a raging fever and sepsis in the days or weeks following delivery. The lack of knowledge about hygiene meant that practices intended to help, like applying poultices to tears or wounds, could inadvertently introduce deadly infections. Maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high, with estimates suggesting that a significant percentage of women died from complications related to childbirth or pregnancy throughout their reproductive lives. Every birth was a gamble, a life or death struggle where the odds were stacked against the mother, and even the safest delivery was fraught with the invisible dangers of infection and the very visible dangers of hemorrhage and prolonged, exhausting labor. The end of a life was often the painful price paid for the beginning of another, a grim reality that women in 960 had faced with stoic acceptance or desperate prayer. Number 6. The mind's labyrinth and the scourge of demonic influence. Imagine being plagued by unseen torments, your thoughts racing uncontrollably, your emotions swinging wildly, or a profound sadness settling over you like an impenetrable fog. In 960, especially within the structured and deeply religious world of the monastery, such experiences were rarely understood as conditions of the mind or brain, but rather as spiritual afflictions, moral failings, or, terrifyingly, the insidious work of demonic forces. For women, whose emotional and physical states were often already viewed with suspicion and linked to their perceived weaker nature, mental distress was an especially isolating and dangerous reality. There was no concept of mental health as a distinct field of medicine, no understanding of neurochemistry, and certainly no therapy beyond prayer and sometimes brutal spiritual interventions. If a nun or a woman seeking refuge in a monastery exhibited signs of what we would now diagnose as depression, anxiety, psychosis, or even epilepsy, the prevailing explanations immediately turned to the supernatural. A sudden shift in mood, a loss of appetite, or persistent weeping might be interpreted as a sign of spiritual weakness, a failure of faith, or the direct influence of a demon seeking to corrupt her soul. Visions or hallucinations, rather than being seen as symptoms of a neurological or psychiatric disorder, were often interpreted as either divine revelations, if the woman was a saintly figure, or more commonly, as demonic trickery. This dualistic view meant that help, if it came at all, was almost never medical in our modern sense. Instead, the treatment for mental distress often involved a series of religious rituals and interventions aimed at expelling the perceived evil or reinforcing moral rectitude. This could include intense periods of prayer, fasting, or vigil. The woman might be isolated from the community, lest her affliction spread or disturb the others. Exorcism, a ritual to cast out demons, was a terrifying and often physically demanding ordeal. It involved prayers, anointing with holy oil, and sometimes severe restraint or physical discomfort, all believed to drive the malevolent spirit from the afflicted individual. While intended to heal, these practices could be deeply traumatic, especially for someone already experiencing severe mental distress. Imagine being convinced you are possessed, undergoing a frightening ritual, and then finding no relief, only further fear and confusion. The humoral theory, which governed physical health, also extended its reach into the realm of the mind. An excess of black bile, for example, was believed to cause melancholy, a state of profound sadness and lassitude. Treatments aimed at rebalancing this humor might include bloodletting, purging, or specific herbal concoctions. While some herbs might have had mild sedative properties, these treatments were often ineffective and sometimes dangerous, offering little true relief for deep-seated mental suffering. The distinction between physical and mental illness was blurred to the point of non-existence, and spiritual explanations often trumped any attempt at empirical observation. Consider a woman suffering from what we might now call postpartum depression. Perhaps a laywoman who had given birth at or near the monastery. Her overwhelming sadness, fatigue, and detachment from her child might be seen not as a medical condition requiring compassionate care, but as a lack of piety or even a demonic attack on her maternal bonds. She might be encouraged to pray more, to fast, or to confess perceived sins, rather than receiving any form of emotional or practical support. Profound lack of understanding meant that genuine suffering was often met with judgment, fear, or ritualistic interventions that failed to address the root cause of the distress. For women, who are already subject to significant societal and religious pressures, the inability to articulate or receive understanding for their mental struggles compounded their isolation and suffering, leaving them trapped in a labyrinth of their own minds, with no clear path to true healing. Number 5. The hand of God and the scarcity of human care. In 960 AD, especially within the sacred confines of a monastery, illness was not merely a physical phenomenon. It was frequently interpreted as a divine message, a test of faith, a punishment for sin, or an opportunity for spiritual growth. This profound intertwining of health and spirituality meant that the first, and often only, line of treatment was prayer, intercession, and reliance on the miraculous power of God or the saints. While faith could offer solace and strength, it also meant that the development of empirical medical practices was often sidelined, and direct human intervention in healthcare was viewed as secondary to divine will. For women, this reality could be particularly grim, leaving them vulnerable to illnesses that a more practical approach might have alleviated. When a woman, perhaps a nun or a lay sister, fell ill, the initial response from the monastic community would almost certainly be fervent prayer. The infirmarian, whether a monk or a nun, would likely offer spiritual comfort, read from scripture, and lead communal prayers for her recovery. Relics of saints believed to possess healing powers might be brought to her bedside, or she might be encouraged to make a pilgrimage to a holy site if her condition allowed. The idea was that sickness was not just a biological malfunction, but a spiritual one, and therefore spiritual remedies were paramount. Miraculous cures were sought and celebrated, reinforcing the belief that God's intervention was the ultimate healer, overshadowing any human medical efforts. This emphasis on the divine had a profound impact on the kind of care a woman received. While some monasteries maintained herb gardens and compiled texts on medicinal plants, these remedies were often seen as supplementary to spiritual practices. Herbal concoctions might be administered, but often without precise dosage or a deep understanding of their pharmacological effects beyond traditional knowledge passed down through generations. Powerful analgesic, like opium poppy, though known, would have been used sparingly, and perhaps with a sense of moral apprehension, as suffering itself was sometimes considered a path to spiritual purification. The belief was that enduring pain with fortitude could bring one closer to God. This perspective, while offering spiritual strength, also meant that little effort was made to alleviate suffering through what we would now consider basic pain management. Moreover, if a woman's illness was seen as a punishment for sin, perhaps for perceived moral failings or even a lack of sufficient piety, her suffering might be viewed as justly deserved. This could lead to a lack of urgency in providing comfort or practical aid, as the illness was fulfilling its divine purpose. While compassionate care was certainly a Christian ideal, the interpretation of suffering as a divine trial could, paradoxically, hinder efforts to alleviate it. The monastic records and hagiographies of the time are filled with stories of holy women enduring immense physical suffering with stoicism, glorifying their endurance as a sign of spiritual strength rather than seeking active medical intervention. Beyond the spiritual aspect, the very idea of organized, professional human healthcare was rudimentary. Physicians were rare, often attached to wealthy courts or cathedrals, and their knowledge was limited. Monasteries might have an infirmarian, but this person was not a trained doctor in the modern sense. They were typically monks or nuns with some practical experience, a basic knowledge of herbs, and perhaps some ancient medical texts. Their tools were simple, their understanding of disease causation minimal, and their ability to perform complex medical procedures virtually non-existent. There was no concept of a medical degree, no standardized training, and no regulatory bodies overseeing medical practice. The care a woman received was largely dependent on the limited knowledge and resources available within that specific monastic community, filtered through a pervasive belief in divine omnipotence and a reluctance to overstep what was perceived as God's plan. The hand of God, while offering spiritual solace, also implicitly limited the scope and development of effective human medical intervention, leaving women to face their ailments with prayers and very little else. Number 4. The whispering walls and the absence of specialized care. Imagine a world where your most intimate health concerns unique to your female body are met with a polite but profound silence, or perhaps addressed by individuals with little direct experience or specific training in women's health. In 960 AD, within the monastic system, this was a stark reality for women. Monasteries, while often centers of learning and charity, were primarily structured for male monastic life, and their approach to healthcare largely reflected this. The concept of specialized medical care, particularly for women's reproductive health, was virtually non-existent. The few individuals with any medical knowledge were often monks, meaning women faced significant barriers due to modesty, social norms, and a fundamental lack of understanding regarding their distinct physiological needs. For nuns living within a convent, their healthcare was typically managed by the infirmarian, usually an older, experienced nun. This nun would have knowledge of herbal remedies, basic nursing care, and perhaps some traditional birthing practices if the convent occasionally assisted laywomen in labor. However, her training was practical and inherited, not academic or specialized. She would understand symptoms based on observation and common lore, but she would have no deep knowledge of female anatomy beyond what was visibly apparent or understood through basic, often flawed ancient texts. Conditions related to menstruation, fertility, pregnancy, complications, or gynecological issues would be approached with a mixture of general remedies, spiritual comfort, and a significant degree of guesswork. The idea of a gynecologist, or even a physician with a particular focus on female health, was centuries away. When conditions became severe or required more complex interventions, the options for women were incredibly limited. In some cases, a physician monk from a nearby male monastery might be called upon. This presented significant challenges for a woman. The societal norms of the time dictated extreme modesty, especially for women in religious orders. The thought of a male physician examining a female patient, particularly for sensitive issues, would have been deeply uncomfortable and potentially scandalous. Such examinations would have been cursory at best, limited by decorum and the lack of proper instruments for internal examination. Imagine trying to describe your internal pain or discomfort without a shared language of anatomical understanding through layers of clothing and to someone who might be prohibited by religious rule from touching you directly without great necessity. This distance, born of modesty and religious separation, often meant that serious conditions went undiagnosed or mistreated. Furthermore, the overall medical knowledge of the period was generalized. There was no concept of specialization as we understand it. A physician, if one was available, was a general practitioner, treating everything from broken bones to fevers, often relying on the same humoral theories for every ailment. For women, this meant that their unique health challenges, such as difficulties with childbirth, postpartum complications, or conditions related to the female reproductive system, were not addressed by a specific body of knowledge or trained professionals. They were simply another set of symptoms to be interpreted through the prevailing, generalized, and often incorrect medical lens. Monastic infirmaries, while providing refuge and basic care, were not equipped to handle complex medical emergencies or chronic conditions specific to women. Their role was primarily to provide comfort, spiritual support, and very rudimentary physical care, often for minor ailments or the sick and elderly within their own community. Consequence of this absence of specialized care was profound suffering. A woman enduring persistent menstrual pain might be told to pray harder or to endure it as a penance. A woman struggling with infertility might be seen as divinely disfavored, with no medical recourse to understand or address her condition. Serious internal issues, like ovarian cysts or uterine fibroids, would go undiagnosed, causing immense pain and potentially life-threatening complications, all without the possibility of an accurate diagnosis or effective intervention. The whispering walls of the monastery, while offering peace and spiritual sustenance, also echoed with the silent suffering of women whose distinct medical needs were simply not understood, acknowledged, or adequately addressed by the limited and generalized healthcare practices of 960 AD. Number 3. The unseen enemy and the peril of unwashed hands. Imagine a world where cleanliness, as we understand it, was a foreign concept, and the invisible agents of disease moved freely among the sick, unnoticed and unchecked. In 960 AD, particularly within the communal living spaces of monasteries, a profound lack of understanding about hygiene and infection control was a grim reality that directly impacted women's health. The very air, water, and surfaces could harbor unseen enemies, and practices intended to help often inadvertently spread contagion. This pervasive ignorance of germ theory, which was centuries away from discovery, meant that even simple wounds could become deadly, and common illnesses could sweep through a community with devastating speed. Monastic infirmaries, though intended as places of healing, often inadvertently facilitated the spread of disease. With no knowledge of microscopic pathogens, there were no protocols for sterilization or sanitation. Surgical tools, if used at all, would be wiped clean but never truly disinfected. Dressings for wounds might be made from unwashed cloth, applied with unwashed hands. The infirmarian might move from tending to one sick individual to another, carrying invisible contagions on their hands or clothing. Imagine a woman suffering from a wound, perhaps a cut or an abrasion, which festered and grew hot and swollen. In 960, this would be attributed to bad humors or perhaps a spiritual failing. The reality, however, was often a bacterial infection introduced by unsanitary conditions that could quickly lead to sepsis and death. The lack of understanding about how infection spread meant that these basic principles of cleanliness, which we now take for granted, were simply not observed. Communal living within monasteries also presented significant hygienic challenges. Shared living quarters, common eating areas, and basic sanitation facilities meant that diseases could spread rapidly through a community. Water sources might be contaminated, leading to outbreaks of dysentery or other waterborne illnesses. The disposal of human waste was rudimentary, often relying on open privies or simple pits, which could attract pests and contaminate surrounding areas, further spreading disease. While some monasteries had systems for bathing, personal hygiene was not practiced with the same rigor as it is today. Frequent hand washing, particularly after tending to the sick or handling waste, was not a recognized practice. This lack of basic hygienic awareness meant that infections, from the common cold to more serious fevers, could easily become epidemics within the cloister walls, affecting women particularly because of their close communal living arrangements. For women, the consequences of this lack of hygiene were particularly dire in the context of childbirth. As explored previously, puerperal fever was a terrifying killer. The very act of birth, if attended by unwashed hands or in an unsanitary environment, could introduce deadly bacteria into the mother's body through the open wounds and susceptible tissues of the birth canal. Care provided postpartum, including cleaning and dressing any tears, was also conducted without knowledge of sterility, further increasing the risk of infection. A woman might survive the grueling process of labor only to succumb to an infection that could have been prevented with simple soap and water. Had the understanding existed, even common ailments became more dangerous. A chance cold could lead to a fatal infection. Skin conditions could become widespread and severely uncomfortable due to lack of cleanliness. The infirmarian might offer remedies based on observation, herbs to reduce fever, poultices to draw out pus, but without understanding the microscopic culprits, these interventions were often insufficient to combat the invisible army of bacteria and viruses. The grim reality for women in 960 AD was that their very environment, the communal spaces and limited medical practices, unknowingly posed a constant threat to their health, turning even minor ailments into potential life-threatening crises due to the pervasive and deadly ignorance of proper hygiene and infection control. Number 2. The unending ache and the scarcity of solace from pain. Imagine living in a world where intense physical suffering was not only common, but also largely untreatable, where relief from agonizing pain was a distant dream or a temporary respite offered by potent yet unpredictable natural substances. In 960, particularly for women experiencing the unique and often excruciating pains associated with their biology, the scarcity of effective pain relief was a grim and pervasive reality. There were no modern analgesics, no advanced understanding of pain pathways, and very little that could truly alleviate chronic or acute suffering beyond crude herbal remedies, or the stoic acceptance encouraged by religious belief. Menstruation, often accompanied by severe cramping and discomfort, was simply endured, sometimes with the aid of warm compresses or herbal teas like chamomile, but rarely with anything truly effective. Childbirth, as previously explored, was an ordeal of unimaginable agony, prolonged and intense, with no epidurals, no pain medication beyond a few sips of a weak herbal concoction, or perhaps a minute amount of opium. Poppy extract if it was available and considered appropriate. The birthing woman was expected to suffer, as pain in childbirth was often viewed as a consequence of Eve's sin, a divine punishment for the fall of humanity. This spiritual interpretation, while providing a framework for enduring suffering, also meant that active measures to alleviate it were often not considered necessary or even morally desirable. Beyond these specific female experiences, general illnesses and injuries also brought immense pain. A broken bone, a deep wound, a raging fever, or a chronic ailment like arthritis would be met with very limited options for pain management. The medical knowledge of the time did not include effective surgical anesthetics. If a limb needed to be set or a wound needed to be stitched, the patient would be fully conscious, experiencing every moment of the procedure. Imagine the terror of facing such an intervention, knowing that excruciating pain was guaranteed, with nothing but fortitude or a strong sedative to dull the edge of the agony. Herbal remedies were the primary source of pain relief. Opium, poppy, known for its powerful analgesic properties, was used, but likely in limited quantities, often difficult to cultivate or procure, and its effects were understood through observation rather than precise measurement. Other plants like mandrake or henbane also possessed sedative or narcotic properties, but their use was often risky due to their toxicity, making dosage extremely difficult and accidental poisoning a constant threat. These were not refined medications. They were crude plant extracts, often prepared with varying potencies, making their effectiveness and safety unpredictable. The infirmarian in a monastery might administer these, but always with caution, and likely only for the most severe cases of suffering. Pervasive belief in the spiritual value of suffering also contributed to the grim reality of pain. To endure pain with patience and faith was seen as a virtuous act, a way to purify the soul and draw closer to God. This perspective, while providing a framework for coping with hardship, often discouraged the active pursuit of pain relief. A woman suffering from a chronic ailment might be encouraged to offer up her pain as a sacrifice rather than being actively sought out for medical intervention. This societal and religious conditioning meant that pain was not merely a physical sensation but a moral and spiritual one, making its alleviation less of a priority. The grim reality for women in 960 AD was a life lived often in the shadow of unrelenting physical discomfort, where solace from pain was either fleeting, dangerous, or simply not considered a worthy goal, leaving them to bear their burdens with a stoicism. Number 1. The veiled voices and the absence of choice. Imagine a woman's life shaped by profound societal and religious expectations, where her decisions, especially concerning her body and health, were rarely her own. In 960 AD, for women seeking or receiving healthcare within monastic or community settings, this was a stark and disempowering reality. Their voices were often veiled by patriarchal structures, their choices limited by a lack of education, and their bodies viewed as subject to forces beyond their personal control, whether those forces were spiritual, societal, or familial. The absence of agency meant that even in moments of profound vulnerability and illness, a woman might have little say in her own care. For a woman living in 960, and whether she was a humble peasant, a respected noblewoman, or a devout nun, her role in society was largely defined by her relationship to men, as a daughter, a wife, a mother, or a spiritual bride of Christ within the convent. Her legal standing, her property rights, and her personal autonomy were severely restricted. This societal framework extended directly into matters of health. If a woman fell ill, decisions about her care would often be made by her husband, father, a male guardian, or, if she was a nun, by the abbess, or even a male monastic superior. Her own preferences, fears, or understanding of her body would likely be secondary to the directives of these authorities. Imagine being gravely ill, enduring intense pain, and having no power to choose who attended to you, what remedies were administered, or even where you received care. The lack of education for most women further compounded their voicelessness in medical matters. While some aristocratic women and nuns might have been literate, the vast majority of women were not. They could not read the few available medical texts, nor could they articulate their symptoms with the precise language that might have been understood by the rare learned physician. Their understanding of their own bodies was often based on folk wisdom and personal experience, which might conflict with the prevailing, albeit flawed, academic medical theories held by the few who were educated. This disparity in knowledge created an insurmountable barrier, making it difficult for women to advocate for themselves or question the treatments they received. They were largely passive recipients of care, trusting or forced to trust those in authority, however limited their medical understanding might be. Even within the monastic system, where women like abbesses held significant spiritual and administrative power, their authority in medical matters extended primarily to nursing and the administration of traditional herbal remedies. They were not medical professionals in any modern sense, nor were they typically equipped to challenge the fundamental medical beliefs of the era. A nun who felt a particular treatment was harmful might express her discomfort, but ultimately, obedience to the infirmarian or the abbess, and implicitly to divine will, was a cornerstone of monastic life. Her personal desire for a different approach might be interpreted as a lack of faith or humility rather than a valid medical concern. The societal belief that women were inherently weaker, more susceptible to illness, or subject to particular bodily frailties also limited their agency. Their bodies were often seen as mysterious, driven by emotions and humors in ways that were different from men, and therefore required different, often more restrictive forms of care. For example, if a woman suffered from what was believed to be female hysteria, her symptoms might be dismissed as emotional instability rather than a physical ailment, and her own attempts to describe her suffering might be disregarded. The absence of genuine medical understanding intersected with deeply ingrained gender roles, leaving women with little control over their own bodies and health destinies. The grim reality for women in 960 AD was a life lived under the shadow of limited personal choice in healthcare, where their voices were often unheard, their wisdom overlooked, and their bodies managed by others, leaving them to face the formidable challenges of illness with quiet submission.